Food for SDGs, Transforming Food Systems to Build Resilience and Achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, convened on the sidelines of the United Nations High-Level Political Forum. My name is Steve Chu from Buddhist Tsuji Foundation. I'm delighted to be serving as your co-moderator for this side event alongside with Lana Weiganent from ProVeg International. This year, the High-Level Political Forum is focused on the theme of building back better from COVID-19, while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, really taking the time to review the SDGs of education, gender, life below water, life on land, and partnership for the goals. In this context, we know that in order to fully recover from the pandemic and ensure that we are more resilient moving forward, that food systems transformation is a critical part of this process. And we must utilize the confluence of both COVID, climate, and conflict to really have opportunities to rebuild and reimagine the ways our food systems work to empower the most vulnerable and in need. In this lens, we're really happy to be here with you today with representatives from various coalitions of actions that have emerged from the United Nations Food Systems Summit in 2021 to share with the international community how they are working to transform food systems from different strategic directions under this way of really working collaboratively with member states, UN agencies, and civil society to really aid in building resilience and help achieve the SDGs. For those of you joining us on YouTube, we invite you to take this opportunity to ask all of the questions to our representatives. We'll be filtering them to them directly, and we have a Q&A portion during this session as well. So now I'll pass it over to Lana to introduce our distinguished speakers.
Hello, everyone. This is Lana Weiganent from ProVeg International, co-moderating for Steve. And today we're extremely excited to hear from our distinguished speakers, including Lina Mai from the United Nations Food Systems Coordination Hub, as well as Francesco Branca from the Coalition of Action on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems for Children and All. We're excited to hear from Jan from the Coalition of Action, the Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition. We'll also have Lasse Brun joining us from the Coalition of Action on Shifting to Healthy, Humane, and Equitable Livestock Systems, as well as Susan Myers from the School Meals Coalition on Nutrition, Health, and Education for Every Child, and Cristina Tirado from the Coalition of Action of Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance. So we're extremely excited to have this conversation from these coalitions and the Coordination Hub from the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which took place last year, and to hear the progress and their reflection on some important questions. The first question that we'll be jumping to is to hear from our speakers from their perspective of the coalition and group that they are here on behalf of. What are the challenges that we are facing in food systems transformation? And what are the actions that you are taking to help accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? We'll go to Lina Mai first from the Coordination Hub.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. It is great to be here, and it's great to see also the representatives of the coalitions that I am working with and that I am as engagement coordinator responsible for in creating this vibrant ecosystem of support. I want to make 3 points. First of all, and I think Steve already highlighted it, is like, why are we talking about food systems at the high-level political forum, and why do we need to talk about the food systems transformation? And Steve said it, I mean, the catalytic role of sustainable food systems to achieve the SDGs cannot be overlooked, and we need to really, really harness it. And they have a tremendous potential for SDG action through like the 3 Ps: people, planet, and prosperity, nourishing everyone for health and well-being, producing and consuming healthy food in harmony with nature, and also inclusive, transformative, and equitable recovery for the 2030 agenda. So the aim to deliver on the SDG agenda was the motivator to actually organize and set up the UN Secretary General's Food Systems Summit in 2021. And it really brought food systems transformation at the center stage. So that's why we have to really speak about food systems transformation at the high-level political forum. And then you ask about the challenges we are facing. And there are many, and I'm sure my colleagues will highlight from their perspective specific challenges. And I want to focus on the means of implementation, which is one of the 5 action areas listed in the Secretary General's Statement of Action. And means of implementation include finance, governance, data, science and innovation, and trade. And so within those means of implementation, I want to focus on governance. And maybe, I mean, some of the critics said that governance didn't get the adequate attention in the Food Systems Summit. So one reason more that I want to talk about it, also because it is part of SDG 17, which is one of the 5 SDGs that the High-Level Political Forum is focusing on. And we need good governance for food systems. And I want to say now more than ever in this fragile and volatile world where there is lack of trust in institutions, we need good governance. So what is good governance? And good governance is participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and follows the rule of law. So good governance also needs to assure that the views of minorities are taken into account and that the voices of the most vulnerable in society are heard in decision making. And for me, good governance really means that countries need to be at the center stage. And that brings me to the third part of your question, like what actions are we taking? And then I'm speaking on behalf of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Well, the hub's work really puts the countries at the center. So we have a vision is to stimulate and support action for food systems transformation. We have a mission that we want to serve the countries through systemic, country-driven, customized support, translating commitments or country pathways into effective actions. And we want to leverage the UN system's capacities. So you see already the characteristics of good governance reflected in the hub's mission. And we have a work plan that really puts the countries at the center, and we have 6 key functions. Maybe because of time, I will not mention them, but really facilitate the implementation of national pathways is central. So to conclude, the hub wants to practice what we preach and hopes to serve as a mechanism for good governance for food systems transformation. So we want to promote the stewardship of global actions by building consensus, defending each country's right to set their own national priorities and plans, while also contributing towards global priorities and goals. We want to promote dialogues to address externalities and social determinants of malnutrition. We want to ensure accountability, coherence, collaboration, and avoid duplication in this dynamic and ever-changing landscape. Back to you, Lana.
Thank you so much, Lena. I think it was especially helpful for our audience to hear about some of the work that is happening through the Coordination Hub, continuing now this year, even with the UN Food Systems Summit over. The work is by no means over at all. And you also mentioned the importance of consumption of healthy food, which I think is a critical tie to the healthy, sustainable diets work that is happening with Francesco Branca. So Francesco, I'd love to hear from you and the work happening in the coalition, as well as your reflection on the challenges and that we are facing and the actions that are being taken.
Thank you, Lana and Steve, and good day to all. It's a pleasure to be discussing with you and actually to interact with the sister coalitions. I think it's actually a great opportunity to have this global vision of what's happening, because UN Food Systems Summit was, in that sense, very prolific with all these children, and now we have to move and grow and spread the news. But yeah, we are indeed facing challenges, and I would say that the main challenge, despite the discussion of the UN Food Systems Summit, despite also the understanding about what's happening around us being created by the inefficiencies of the food system, we still face a cultural, conceptual challenge. And the concept of sustainable healthy diet is not accepted by all. So that's a big task we have. We need to really provide the necessary detail to provide the arguments for the importance of that direction of change. We also need to be more granular and explain what actually a healthy and sustainable diet is. There's been discussion of, do we have a planetary standardized diet? Do we have diets which are locally based? And of course, the answer has to be articulated. Of course, we have some general guiding principles which are very clear and very strong and absolutely grounded in science. But then, how do we implement those concepts in specific country circumstances, following specific cultures, and also responding to the economic circumstances in which those diets can be implemented. Second challenge is a challenge about the solutions. And we all have been excited during the preparation of the summit to see how many innovative solutions there were. I mean, over 2,000, remember, over 2,000 solutions were proposed, and then they were somehow selected and, collated into, the action track document, and in, document cross-cutting between different action track. But the fact of the matter is that we need to be very clear and offer those who are going to take the actions, the rationale and the demonstration of the cost effectiveness of those measures. So that's I think a challenge we definitely have taken, but we need to be aware that change will not happen unless we are extremely clear of what the priorities should be. And the third challenge is a challenge of our, let's say, stakeholder composition. And again, UN Food System Summit has seen a large stakeholder participation, but then I think we need to specify very well who is doing what, whose responsibility is to initiate the transformation. And we definitely are seeing the governments at the heart of somehow this design with the development of the roadmap. So, but of course, the roadmaps have to be discussed with all stakeholders. But how can we make sure that the public interest comes first? So how can we be inclusive without somehow giving up the specificities of the social and institutional role of each of the group of stakeholders? So how is the Coalition on Healthy Diet from Sustainable Food System dealing with that? So we have focused our work on three aspects. The first aspect is the one around supplying food. So really reorienting the food supply to focus on nutritional value while ensuring livelihoods of those working the food supply. Second is food environment, so improving the food environment to increase accessibility, affordability, and desirability of healthy food. And the third one is the valuing food, so motivating really people, individuals, families, communities to eat healthy diet. And the way we're doing this is to have, number one, the coordination and mobilization of expertise and stakeholders to align across food system action for collective impact. So really having an in-depth support to transform those roadmap into very concrete implementation plan with all those willing to work on that. Second is the peer-to-peer learning between countries. There's a lot of experience, there's a lot of leadership, and we need to build on that leadership around perhaps a subset of those solutions, subset of policy areas around which to find alignment, because I think the scale is the issue. I mean, we cannot have multiple local solutions. They're important, but we also need to bring them to scale. And then the third is really having a series of special projects, very concrete. So for example, can we use the next COP to have very clear nationally determined contribution, including food systems? So that's something that our coalition is working on. Second is to have food-based dietary guidelines with the sustainability element built in. And third, having good monitoring of healthy diets with good indicators. So you see, it's a combination of, let's say, conceptual, cultural, theoretical change and very practical support to the countries who have decided to engage. We have a long number of front-runner countries. I'll mention them quickly: Brazil, Chile, Denmark, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Finland, Ghana, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Norway, Slovenia, Sudan, Sweden, Switzerland, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. I'm very proud of this big group. And of course, we need to demonstrate an impact. And if the impact is there, I'm sure that it will take the whole next session to tell you the list of countries. Thank you.
Amazing. There are so many countries involved, and I think that really shows the uniqueness of these coalitions and this coordination hub, that we are engaging with the member states. It's not just a group of us saying that we want food systems in the NDCs or food-based dietary guidelines, but working on that alongside the countries who can make it happen. So I think that brings out some of the uniqueness in the opportunity and the possibility in these coalitions. And Francesco, you also mentioned stakeholders and the unique local, regional perspectives and different groups. And I'm really excited to hear from Jan, the Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition, the Indigenous people's perspective, and also the work that has been happening through the coalition. They've been facing any challenges or what their focuses are. So Jan, I will pass it to you. Really excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Lana, for the use of the word, and thank you to Project and to the Suki Foundation for the invitation. Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I want to echo the words of Francesco, my brother and colleague from WHO. It's very important that we have these exchanges among coalition. In the end, I think we are all well intended in transforming our food systems and transform them in the right direction to make them sustainable and resilient. Now, this morning when I woke up, I have a cup of coffee. I have 2 cups of coffee. My brain cannot start working without having a cup of coffee. But 15 years ago, you will get the beans, you will grind them, and then you will put them in a mocha and make a steaming cup of coffee. This morning when I woke up, I threw out 2 capsules of aluminum into the dustbin. So my question to all of you is, in which direction are we transforming our food systems? I don't think we are transforming them towards sustainability. Now, when you put aluminum together with coffee, that means you have to extract resources from Mother Earth. And that means that very often you need to encroach and you need to increase the mining all over the world to make sure that people in urban cities can have coffee encapsulated in an aluminum capsule. Is this the right way of doing things? Well, we don't think so. We don't think so in the coalition. We don't think that food systems are being transformed towards a sustainable and resilient direction. And very often the efforts in the agri-food system to make them more sustainable and more resilient and to improve efficiency and productivity, unfortunately, is being done at the expense of indigenous peoples. When we looked at the killing of indigenous peoples across the world, it has increased over the past 5 years, and it keeps increasing. Some of us, we were optimistic, thinking that during the pandemic, the killings will go down because of the confinement. But on the contrary, they keep increasing. And this is very much associated with how thirst our societies have become for resources, mineral resources, wood, any kind of energy resources. And what is very interesting is that more and more research are finding out that agriculture is very much at the center, and food production is very much at the center of this pushing of extending the agricultural frontier, in many cases into indigenous peoples' lands and territories. Why is this a matter of concern? Very simple, because indigenous peoples are the guardians of biodiversity. They preserve 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the planet that our unsustainable food systems have destroyed across the world. So unless we change things, and unless we change the narrative, unless we bring scientists to think differently, to analyze things differently, it's unlikely that we will meet the SDGs by 2030. Remember that we are only 7 harvests away from SDG 2030. We think that is in the next century. It is not. It's only 7 harvests away. You have seen that the number of food insecure in the planet have increased over the past 4 years. That is bad news, mainly fueled by conflict, but also fueled, of course, by the COVID pandemic and climate change. So we need to do things differently very rapidly. And this is why we put together this coalition with 7 member countries, with indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of this coalition. The steering committee is composed of 7 countries and 8 indigenous peoples, representing the 7 sociocultural regions of the world. men and women coming from remote areas, that what they are telling us loud and clear is our food systems are unsustainable and unresilient. And are we transforming them in the right direction? Unless we do things differently, very rapidly, it's not going to be likely that we are going to meet the SDGs with sustainable and resilient food systems. The stories that we are hearing on climate change and the stories that we are hearing on the rapid urbanization of different parts of the world are changing the diets very rapidly, are changing the food habits, and more importantly, and disregarding traditional and local indigenous foods that are being eliminated by deforestation, are being eliminated by the killing of the pollinators, and are being eliminated by our thirst for resources. So the challenges are tremendous, but unless we come up with a new narrative, unless we come up with new normative sets, and unless we come up with new policy actions, we will not meet the SDGs. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much. This is a completely essential perspective and issue to address in any food systems transformation when we're talking about sustainability or resilience, or the transition and changes that need to happen in our food systems. We must make sure to think about the indigenous peoples being impacted and the issues that are already happening, for instance, with the deaths of indigenous peoples and the land grabbing and things like that. So thank you so much, Jan, for bringing in this critical viewpoint. And Christina, I would love to pass to you for more on the Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance and the challenges you might be seeing, as well as the work that you're doing for climate resilience. So I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Prover and Tutsi. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. So the Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance is evolving. It has been changing and is providing different aspects of the thematic areas that were defined before in order to provide a platform that is a platform for achieving climate resilient food systems by making synergies with the efforts across the different actors who are part of the Alliance. So one of the aspects critical of the Alliance, one of the missions is to join forces to accelerate action towards climate resilient, sustainable, equitable, and inclusive food systems, but in a coherent way. So what is making this different is that we are focusing on the most vulnerable countries and regions, in particular the arid and semi-arid lands, the small island developing states, the landlocked developing countries, and the least developed countries. And the effort in bringing them is being titanic. So, you know, but we are going to get it there. The main themes that the Alliance is covering stay the same: is climate adaptation, mitigation and resilience, climate risk reduction and risk management, and the integration of resilience in international and national policy plans and initiatives. So the nexus approach to the water, food, energy is a very relevant aspect, and the Resilience Frontiers initiative, which, you know, Prover is part of it and is like bringing totally different non-government stakeholders. So the something that we have been discussing a lot were the realms of the interventions that are covered by the Alliance. So it's broad, but since the partners work in such a different areas of work, we have been looking at the ecosystem, at the landscapes, at the seascapes, at the community, at the household, and at the individual level. And the individual resilience is critical. Otherwise, if we don't include individuals, we cannot work with human rights, and we do. This is the realms that we have so far. The drivers of fragility and the food crisis that we are addressing, well, I mean, we have it all: the conflict and instability, climate extremes, biodiversity loss, economic shocks, and pandemics. And the capacities that the food system resilience are working on is in prevention, in anticipating the shocks and managing the risks, reducing the exposure to impacts with early warning systems, and the capacity of absorb, the ability to respond and cope in adverse events in short time, early warning, early response, and adapting to any evolving risk scenario and compounded and cascading risks. So the only way that we can manage this, it will be increasing the capacity to transform when the current system is no longer economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. And transformation, we don't have the same definition that, just transforming the food system. Maybe this transformation is to drop something, but for good, for a good reason and for better. So this is something, important to consider. And basically, I mean, I could share with you some of the members that are engaged, but basically are we are in a process of reconfirming the membership, and the countries that are the priority are the ones that I have mentioned before in this resilient and vulnerable and at-risk areas. So I leave it here, and yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Good to stay with you.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's wonderful to have you involved, and excited to hear more as we go into the continuing conversation as well. Then I will pass it to Susan next to hear from the School Meals Coalition and the challenges and the work that has been happening as well. Really excited to have you here.
Well, thank you, Lana, and thank you to Steve as well for including the School Meals Coalition in this important discussion. And I want to echo comments made by some of the other coalition representatives that it's also really helpful to get updates on their work and think about some opportunities for collaboration, because we are looking at some of the same areas that have been mentioned by some of the previous speakers. The School Meals Coalition is a government-driven initiative and specifically built and launched at the Food Systems Summit, like I think all of the coalitions that are represented here, to really address the current context facing the world, which are increased hunger and malnutrition related to the COVID-19 crisis, the impacts of conflict and climate change, and now, of course, exacerbated by the huge challenge of rising food and energy costs, and of course, directly related to school closures that happened as a result of COVID-19, and the recognition that school meals programs play a really essential role in children's lives and in their families and society's lives. The birth of the coalition was a recognition that school meals programs are a good value for money intervention. They result in up to $9 for every $1 invested in these programs, and that they are proven solutions not only for addressing food insecurity, but also for outcomes related to health, education, and social protection. And because of their cross-sector approach and their cross-sector impact, they also help transform societies and economies, especially with the increased focus on homegrown school feeding, which I think I'll be able to go into a little bit more later on in our discussion, which produces impact across societies and well beyond the school children the programs are specifically geared to serve. The objectives of the coalition just quickly include not only restoring school meals programs to their pre-COVID-19 levels, but also reaching the 73 million children who were estimated to have not been reached by programs before the pandemic, and also very focused on the quality of programs through more diverse, healthier, and more sustainable options, and also taking advantage of opportunities for nutrition education that extend throughout lifetimes. And the coalition is working with a number of partners, including the SDG 2 Hub, including the Rockefeller Foundation and others on this third objective of the coalition around healthier diets, which again may be an opportunity for some cross-pollination with some of the other coalitions represented on this call. So thank you again for bringing us together. This coalition has continued to grow and gain traction since its launch. I think we had about 35 or so governments that were part of the launch of the coalition last fall. We're now up to almost 70 governments that have signed a declaration of commitment to support the coalition's objectives. And we have almost 70, coincidentally, other non-government partners who have joined the coalition and committed to working with governments to support their commitments. And so, while we're still doing quite a bit of work at the global level, including around this year's UN Transforming Education Summit, given obviously the relevance to the school meals agenda, we're also really working to ensure that the coalition can be a platform for driving action at the national level and to really work with governments in operationalizing their commitments to the coalition. Knowing that this is even more critical in the current environment where we're already seeing the impacts of increased pricing on school meals programs, with some governments having to cut back on the number of days that they offer school meals, on the number of children that they're able to reach, and also on the quality of the food that they offer in these programs. So the impact is already very real, yet we know that in the past, governments have also reinforced school meals programs as one way of addressing food crises and food insecurity. So we will be doing everything we can to work with governments toward that goal. In terms of just other ways that we're working, to answer your question, what actions is the coalition taking? In addition to this specific work with governments around their commitments, the coalition is also setting up 5 initiatives that are specifically in areas where we're addressing gaps and helping to bring down some of the barriers that have been identified by governments and others that have kept school meals programs from reaching their full potential in the past. These 5 areas are, the first is around research and the evidence base. We have a research consortium that is hosted by the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. This part of the coalition actually predated the launch of the coalition itself. It's been around for over a year and has a quite robust set of ongoing work, including some communities of practice in certain areas. We have a data and monitoring coalition, our data and monitoring initiative, which sits at the UN World Food Program, which is looking to address some of the gaps in data and have a better system of monitoring and accountability going forward. We are about to formally launch a sustainable financing initiative. This work is being done at the Global Education Commission and has very much been developed alongside the activity of the Transforming Education Summit. It will launch on July 19th with individuals like Gordon Brown and others. It's importantly not being set up as a fund, but being set up as a working initiative to both advocate for engagement of some new financing bodies, but also for the development of new and innovative mechanisms that really are geared towards working with governments on the pathways that are necessary for governments to fully finance their school meals program, which is the ultimate goal and the reality in many countries already. We also are setting up a peer-to-peer network of best practices that the German government is taking the lead on, and a communications and partner outreach initiative, which will also launch later this year. And I'm specifically working on it as part of my role as a senior advisor on advocacy and communications for the World Food Program. And that initiative will be specifically working to create opportunities for non-government partners to work with governments in the implementation of their commitments to the coalition. So that is kind of the how of how the coalition works and how we are specifically working to generate some new solutions and ways of working on this issue. And very much, at the encouragement of our government leaders that are leading the coalition, leveraging the ongoing activity coming out of the Food Systems Summit, since that's where this coalition was born, and that's obviously a community that we very much want to stay engaged with going forward. So that's a quick snapshot, and looking forward to continued discussion and hearing from the other speakers as well.
Thank you, Susan, for so many concrete details on the work that's happening in the School Meals Coalition. I think we can also appreciate looking at the impacts on youth and young people and children with Youngo Agriculture as one of the co-hosts for the events, where Youngo is the constituency of children and youth for UN climate change. And another area that Youngo also addresses strongly as the youth voice is talking about factory farming, making sure to talk about the industrial animal agricultural impacts on the planet and how that will ultimately impact the futures of youth around the world. So I'm really excited to hear from Lasse from shifting to healthy, humane, and equitable livestock systems. I'd love to hear more about your challenges and the work happening in your coalition as well. Pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Lana, and thank you so much to ProVeg International and to Chief Foundation for the invitation. And thanks to my esteemed colleagues for their introductions and for their outline of what they're taking forward. And I'm particularly happy to see the diversity in terms of like who's represented and what coalitions we're representing, because let's just be honest here. One of the issues with the Food Systems Summit was that it wasn't really representative enough. There was some issues in terms of ensuring that everybody was able to have their voices raised there. So I'm happy to see that the coalitions is where the real work is going to be happening, and I'm very happy that old friends like Lena is going to be overseeing that, and I feel things are in good hands already. So when it comes to our coalition, well, there are 3 livestock coalitions within the hub now, but ours is the only one that really focuses on a more systems approach to addressing livestock systems. And the reason why we formulated it was, of course, to be kind of like open about what the livestock production currently constitutes. So as you know, in livestock production, industrial livestock production specifically, is one of the biggest damages of planetary issues, whether it's climate change, biodiversity, water equality, and so forth, but is also very much creating inequity and problems in terms of food distribution. Many of you will have scrutinized the latest IPCC report that came out just about 6 months ago. And to my knowledge, and Christine and others may correct me if I'm wrong, but this was the first time I actually saw hidden inside somewhere in the report that there was a direct link between the overconsumption of animal protein like meat, dairy, and eggs in the global north, and hunger and nutrition deficiency in least developed countries and global south countries. And I think that's really important, and that's something we're going to be focusing a lot on, because it is so important that we focus on an approach that deals with the systemic inequality we're seeing in the world today. I tend to use strong words like we're still seeing lots of land grabbing associated with livestock production. And in fact, we have a kind of a neo-colonial food system still. And that's something we really need to break. And the livestock aspect is key to that, because it is creating so many of those problems. But addressing the livestock situation can also solve a lot of these problems we're seeing. So the need to address both consumption and production is key to addressing these challenges. And in the coalition, we are having 4 key approaches that are addressing a lot of the SDGs, and I'll just mention them here. One is a shift to healthy, sustainable, culturally appropriate, and it's important, culturally appropriate diets, which includes reduction in average global meat and dairy production. That's 1. 2, a shift from industrial livestock systems of factory farming to nature-friendly, pastoral, regenerative, and agricultural livestock cultural systems, and a shift to high standards of welfare, which should be, a correlation of the shift to extensive systems, but not isn't always. So that's something we need to address as well. And last but not least, is ensuring a just transition. So we want to work very closely with other coalitions to achieve our goals, particularly coalitions working on agroecology, healthy food, sustainable food systems, and so forth. And also those represented here today, makes a lot of sense to really compare notes and find a common food path forward. Some of the ways we're going to be taking this work forward will be looking at ways of engaging countries to build specific pathways for their food systems. And we're going to be focusing on three main areas there. One is the policy aspect. So that's policy dialogue, engagement, and advocacy. Two, driving and supporting the development of new research and evidence-based briefings. Just to pause on that for a second, we all know where we want to go, at least within this space, but it is not always clear how we get there. The journey from now on until 2030 and indeed beyond is going to be crucial. So, and we need evidence, we need science, and the more science and evidence we have, the better we can construct that. So that's also something we were going to be talking to our fellow coalitions about, finding ways of coalescing around research needs to find and maximize the use of that. And finally, number three, facilitate the knowledge exchange and co-creation and peer-to-peer learning. When we get further down in the conversations, I'll speak a bit more about the practical steps we're taking to involve stakeholders on the ground. But for now, I just want to highlight the 5 SDGs I really think we're engaging on. One is zero hunger. Unless we address the inequity in the food system and the overconsumption in the global north, then how it's related to nutrition deficiency in the global south, we're not going to get it. So we're addressing that as well. Global health and well-being. Well, as Lena can tell me, as the expert from the WHO, it is crucial that we change the way we eat from a health perspective as well. That means cutting down on animal protein consumption and shifting to more whole food, plant-based diets. SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. We need to move away from the old dogma that you cannot have sustainable food consumption and economic growth at the same time. In fact, all evidence points to that is actually going to be the exact outcome of shifting to sustainable diets, that we're going to have more jobs and therefore strong economic growth. SDG 10 on reduced inequalities. Well, I touched on that before, but it's important to emphasize the role of food systems when it comes to inequality in a wider sense, but particularly because of the way we eat. And finally, of course, SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, which is always, in SDG conversations, I find marginalized a little bit because it's kind of taken for granted that it's dealt with in some of the other SDGs, but it isn't. It really deserves an SDG on its own, and we're going to be ensuring that that gets covered as well. So I think I'll leave it there and get into the details when we go to our next question. Thank you.
Perfect. I think that was a great way to wrap up our conversation on the first question. And I'm really excited to pass it on to Steve to moderate the second question.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Lana. And thanks to all of our panelists for really bringing this fantastic work and sharing it so publicly. I think as we move forward in thinking about how we transform, like Jan was saying, transforming our food systems in the right direction, right? We want to emphasize within this side event the critical importance of engaging with local stakeholders, right? So for this next component, I'd love to reflect with everyone, how do we, as these various coalitions of actions and hubs, work to strengthen our engagement across the food systems with civil society actors, farmers, producers, indigenous leaders, and what does that vision look like? Are we doing that work right now? Is that something that we need to do more of? I'd love to explore that. So I'll start with Jan. I know, Jan, as you were reflecting with Lana and us earlier about like this challenges we're facing within the Indigenous coalition of action, we're really seeing that we need to create new narratives, we need to create new norms, right? And that has to stem from both the ground up and the top down. And I'd love to hear some of your reflections on how you're envisioning this engagement as we work to transform our food systems in the right direction.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. And in the first question, we talked about the challenges. We need to now start thinking of the solutions. And that's why we are all here. What can we do together collectively? I think it was Einstein that said that you cannot use the same tools that have created a problem to resolve a problem. So we have a problem, we have an issue. We need to think of different ways. We need to look at the matter from different entry points. I think we are all well-intended, but that is not enough. We need to expand our perceptions, and we need to challenge our points of view. Otherwise, it's unlikely that in such a short window of time, we will make things happen. Now, the SDGs, the spirit of the SDGs is leaving no one behind. My question to all of you is, what do we do with those that are already behind? How are we going to bring them up front? It's not about leaving new people behind, which none of us wants, but what do we do with those that are already behind? And you will agree with me that indigenous peoples for hundreds of years have been behind. Now, when we look at the narrative on the work that we are doing in the coalitions and in the UN, we try to categorize them as civil society, producer organizations. But I want to echo the words of the new chair of the UN Permanent Forum, Darío Mejía. And he was saying the concept of stakeholders and non-state actors and state actors was really created with the creation of the states. But in most cases, indigenous peoples have been in Mother Earth way beyond the systems of the current states. So they don't fit into that category. They have governance systems, they have customary systems, but more importantly, if you look at the world, Steve, Lana, colleagues, the eldest food systems in the world that have proved to be resilient, are sustainable, are the indigenous people's food systems or the aboriginals. They go way beyond the creation of agriculture in the history of humankind, and still they are functioning. So probably they have figured out many things that we haven't been able to look into detail and that we need to reflect upon. And I want to use the word reflect, because thinking is not enough. We need to reflect on what we are doing, and we need to reflect on different ways of doing that. What is our coalition reflecting on? We have two very basic goals. The first one is to respect, recognize, and protect indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems. As you know, on the lead to the UN Food Systems Summit, the scientific committee recognized for the first time that indigenous people's food systems are game changers. This is not a terminology that indigenous peoples use, but scientists do, in terms of changing the game and changing the current way that food systems are operating. So what that means for indigenous peoples is that for the first time, there is an overarching recognition by the scientific community that they are knowledge holders. So definitely we need to include them. And I invite the colleagues here of these coalitions to include indigenous peoples, experts among their constituencies. Otherwise, the work that they will do will not touch upon the 467 million indigenous peoples that populate more than 90 countries in 7 sociocultural regions of the world. We talked very often of diversity, and I just talked before about biodiversity. But if we look at cultural diversity, 4,000 out of the 6,000 remaining languages in the planet are indigenous languages. There's more than 5,000 indigenous groups. So it will be a pity that we turn Mother Earth into an homogeneous group of people that eat an homogeneous group of foods. So there is still an opportunity. And to do that, I want to call upon the second goal of our coalition. And the second goal of our coalition is to disseminate and scale up traditional knowledge and good practices from indigenous people's food and knowledge systems that can inform the global debate. We've been looking at the work of Susan and the coalition on food system, on school meals. We're extremely interested because we all agree that the school meals are fundamental. At the same time, the research that we are doing with indigenous peoples is that the school meals very often are not targeting indigenous peoples, and the diets that they receive, in a way, they condition their future food taste, and they condition their understanding of their own food system. So we want to work with the coalition of Susan to see how we can make school meals sensitive to indigenous peoples. We are following very closely the coalition of Cristina, and the same with Leis and with Leis Brun and with Francesco Branca. Not only these ones, also all the other ones. The first thing that indigenous peoples wanted in their coalition is to regain, in a way, the control of the coalition. So we have set up a steering committee that is with majority of indigenous peoples. And now we are going to start reaching out to other countries that have some interest in joining. But also we would like to start connecting with other coalitions, because the work is collective. And indigenous peoples are fully aware that the moment that they are recognized as knowledge holders, they also have a responsibility to contribute to the work of other coalitions if we are going to meet the SDGs. They are ready to meet these challenges, but at the same time, they want to be given the space, the opportunity, and they want to be listened to. It's not enough with treating them as vulnerable populations. Nobody is born vulnerable on Mother Earth, nobody. No child, no girl, no boy has ever been born as vulnerable. We make them vulnerable with our decisions and our ill policies. So we need to change that. And there's a very good opportunity to do that collectively. The Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems released the WIPALA paper on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems to inform the world on what Indigenous peoples have to say. And we are doing a second call through the Global Hub on to issue a new WIPALA paper, collective paper, on the importance of collective rights to Indigenous peoples' food systems and biodiversity. Many of the food systems that are protecting biodiversity are nomadic and mobile food systems. They are not settled food systems, and this is largely not understood by policymakers and scientists. And it's one of the problems why we are depleting biodiversity at an incredible rate. When we settle schemes that extract resources much faster than the replenishment capacity of the natural resource base. So we will be looking forward to collaborate with all of you. And the Global Hub is providing the technical support to the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. So we really look forward to connecting with all of you and continue this collective work. Thank you so much for the use of the word.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Jan. I love that you spoke about homogenization, right? And how homogenization leads to erasure. And that in this work that we're doing in transforming our food systems, we must work to have that cultural diversity, to have indigenous knowledge at the forefront, and this very clear clarion call that if we are to really work to achieve all of our SDGs, we must ensure that indigenous knowledge is at the center of each one of these coalitions of action. So I'm really happy that we've been able to bring everyone together in this aspect. And so to move on now, let's jump over to Lasse to really continue to reflect on us on this just and equitable transition of our food systems. How does this work really need the engagement of local stakeholders with civil society, farmers, producers, and how does your coalition of action really envision this work moving forward?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve, and thanks to Jan for the amazing points. And obviously, I agree with you. And I think it's so important to keep in mind what you say, that, you know, as you say, and also I know Hindu Umaru Ibrahim often says, like, the indigenous groups and pastoralists are the original scientists, and I very much agree. And I want to mention resilience here as well. Resilience is going to be so crucial moving forward that it's so important to quote another, to make another quote that, like, I know you like to do, John, is like, to learn about the future, you need to look backwards, right? And we need to look at how have humanity overcome problems in the past with droughts, with erratic weather systems, with difficult times, and why is it that sometimes when modern food systems collapse during a drought, and then the original food systems that indigenous communities are residing over, they actually make it through. There's so much to be learned there, and I very much agree they need to be taken into consideration as scientists as well. And that also leads me to the point that the problems we are facing now are relatively new. A lot of people have this notion that the current food system and the difficulties that entails, particularly around livestock issues, is something that's been going on for millennia. In fact, it was just after World War II when we really had the big agricultural revolution. Up until then, there was not, pesticides used all the time. There was not industrialized livestock. There were lots of other problems, and I won't bash some of the technical innovations that have led to overcoming nutrition deficiency and malnutrition. However, a lot of the problems in terms of overconsumption and destructive food systems is something that has been around for just about 80 years. So we don't need to undo something that's been going on for hundreds of years. It is a relatively new problem, so which should hopefully make it easier to go back, although it's not going to be easy. Coming back to our coalition, one thing I want to say first of all, we want to move away from being a debate club. We want to act. We want to move into concrete solutions we can work on, and that also comes down to, like, who we're engaging with. To address your question, I mean, we need to, sometimes all of us take for granted that when we are working on on international work and in multilateral spaces are trying to create big shift in terms of policy, that there are democracies everywhere. And that's really not the case, right? A lot of the problems we're seeing in terms of implementing policies and making sure things really change is rooted in the lack of democracy in many places, or corrupt regimes. So that, I think, also makes the case even more for including people on the ground who can help on the ground, and then in some cases actually bypass governments that often can be detrimental to the work going forward. Obviously, I'm not talking about those who are engaging in the Food System Summit, but many places around the world there are issues along that. So we always need to keep that in mind. In terms of what we're going to be doing in the coalition, we're going to be looking very much at having a stakeholder-led engagement and an approach to our coalition. And we want to engage a lot of people. I can mention farmers organizations, health organizations, youth, indigenous people. We're also going to be engaging with research organizations, consumers, faith groups, United Nations bodies and programs, philanthropic organizations, and of course a swath of civil society and others, including everybody present here. Right now, we have a steering group that consists of 12 organizations that have a very diverse membership, representing people from the global majority and the global north, including farmers, health, and civil society, and so forth. And I really hope that some of the organizations and coalition representatives who are present today would consider being part of that as well, so we can work much more directly. The coalition is going to be very much rooted in science and evidence, but also very much in the lived experiences of the most vulnerable people. So we are really going to be engaging with, either directly or through our partners, with people on the ground growing the food we eat every day, and talk about the reality of those experiences. And that also, a lot of this is rooted in climate change as well, as a core part. And to Jan's point about what about those who are already suffering now, to put a climate change lens on it, I think we need to up the game on adaptation for existing systems, and not just only talk about mitigation, like preventing it, the problem goes on. So we'll be expanding our membership over the coming weeks and building co-creation, a concrete action plan in which we need all these stakeholders to help us develop it. We're going to be focusing a lot on the just transition, where both in terms of how to ensure that food systems in less developed countries are helped to become better, or how we work with local communities to learn from how they're doing it. Like Jan was saying, that includes pastoralism, silvopastoralism, and smallholder farmers, of course, but also in the global north, the transition I talked about in the beginning, that there is a link between overconsumption and overproduction of meat and dairy in the global north, and that will be addressed through a just transition. And so we can ensure that once we make the big transition, that nobody is left behind. And I just want to finish saying that when it comes to the ownership of taking forward the changes that the coalition are pushing, we're very much adopting the common but differentiated responsibility approach to this, which essentially means that the problem, the responsibility to solve the problems we are facing lies with those who created it in the first place. It's very much adopted from the UNFCCC and that language, but I think it applies really well to what we're doing here. And essentially that means that the biggest changes and the responsibility for making things happen lies with the G20, and actually more specifically the G8 and the G7. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Lasse, for not only lifting up this importance of rule of law, right, and the importance of health of democracy as a means to really achieve sustainable food systems, really paralleling some of those narratives that Lena was speaking to us earlier about what the Coordination Hub is doing to build trust, right? That we need the trust of both governments and people in order to ensure that the work that we're doing is resilient, lasting, and sustainable. But then also speaking to overconsumption, which really leads me perfectly into Francesco to ask the same question, right? Francesco, you spoke earlier about how the work that you're doing, one of the key challenges is really this cultural and conceptual challenge, right? That the narrative of healthy diets isn't necessarily permeated, right? And that we need to do more work in terms of helping everyone understand this. And so I'd love to hear your perspectives on how we're really working as this coalition of action to engage across the food systems with civil society, farmers, producers, to ensure that like representative stakeholder space to help grow this narrative of what is possible, so we don't just end up replicating these overconsumption models that Lasse was speaking to earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Very important point. So first of all, let me clarify that the focus of the coalition has been to engage with member states. So we're really looking into giving them the opportunity to express leadership on food system transformation. Now, the fact of the matter is that, as you know, there have been many country roadmaps, but they're very different. Some of them are more operationalized, some of them are more general. So I think, first of all, we need to make sure that there is a clear vision about what these transformations are. So that's where we are focusing at the moment. But we do acknowledge that unless we have a very capillary engagement with multiple constituencies, things are not going to happen. Now, one element we've been discussing in the coalition has been the concept of the principles of engagement. So we don't want to have the coalition as a place where anybody comes and talks, and it's not a forum for discussion, as also some of the other colleagues mentioned. It has to be something extremely concrete and operational. And then we want to make sure that there are some clear commitments on what kind of actions all the members and the we actually created somehow two tie group. We have core members, and then we have other actors who are associated to the work of the coalition with a specific task to implement. So whether it's civil society, we're also saying private sector of course has to have a role, but we want to make sure that those who engage accept certain principles which are transformative for the food systems. Such as, for example, giving up the policy interference, or reconsidering their marketing policies, particularly on breast milk substitutes. So we would like to engage with those who accept these principles, which we believe are transformational for the food system. But that, of course, I understand leaves out a lot of local stakeholders on which we need to engage. Right, that's in our somehow ambition, but it will take some active reaching out. And clearly, local stakeholders are important elements of transformation. We've been working with cities. There are existing network of cities, but we have not been working on rural communities well enough. And actually, there's a lot of good examples of local communities who have basically by default, by culture, by tradition, healthy and sustainable diets or diet solutions. So how can we, bring them together and network? We don't only have the coalition. Luckily, we have a lot of interesting social movements which are doing that. You're probably familiar with some of them, but how can we engage with those movements who bring together the local rural communities, promoting they're proud of their local production and production system. So I think that's an important task, really the rural one. And what Jon was saying about the indigenous people, it does resonate with us, absolutely. I mean, that's where a lot of that knowledge is, and it would be never enough to connect with them. The other group perhaps is the small and medium enterprises. We often think of, okay, private sector means the big companies. No, it should actually be mainly the small and medium enterprises. We know that food system is largely made of those small and medium enterprises, and probably 2/3 of the food producers are those small and medium enterprises, which are facing research and development challenges, which are facing currently resource challenges, raw materials, energy. So how can they become really actors of transformation without risking their survival? Or in fact, how can that change make them a more successful example? and then, of course, the civil society. And here we have to be very candid. I mean, the civil society wasn't happy of many aspects of the UN Food Systems Summit, and we cannot work without an active role of civil society. So I think the coalitions have a very important role to play to bring them back. And I'm really also looking at my good colleague Lina, because she has a big task of trying to find ways to engage with all the stakeholders, including the ones who have been a little bit more resistant to that engagement. So probably the coalitions and the action at local level could be a good way to start, rather than trying to work with the global institutions. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thanks so much, Francesco, for those reflections. You're right that right now the priority of these coalitions of actions are truly to get member states to take that leadership position, create these roadmaps, and really begin to implement, right? And it's upon this implementation process that engagement with local stakeholders begins to play that role of importance to bring sustainability, resilience into the picture. And I love that you lifted up that there's already existing networks that are doing this work, whether it's in the promotion of healthy and sustainable diets or advocating for indigenous rights within the food system structures within civil society, right? So how do we ensure we don't reinvent the wheel and that we liaise and engage? And to that point, I'd love to pass it over to Lina, thinking about how we win people back, right? Civil society, maybe not the happiest with the outcomes or modalities of what the Food Systems Summit had, but there was really honest, good work that was being done to engage with civil society, right? And how do we, moving forward, continue to ensure that we're engaging with them? And what's the vision from the Food Systems Coordination Hub of engaging with these local stakeholders, similar to what Francesco was just lifting up?
Wow, what a conversation. I really appreciate it. First of all, seeing these coalitions and how they are already now talking to each other and seeing the overlaps, but also the opportunities to work together and listen to each other and bring each other into their own work. I think it's great, and thank you, Steve and Lana, for already kind of doing my work in that sense of bringing the coalitions together. I'm not needed anymore. Anyway, yeah, how to win back? I mean, one red thread that I'm happy to see also in the conversation is what I started with is good governance, because then we talk about listening to all the voices and creating the trust and sharing information and having the science and so on. So I think in that sense, the hub also, again, I would say, needs to lead by practicing what we preach and having this good governance. What already was mentioned, also to bring in the civil society, create the trust. I would say the coalitions have an important role because they are kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives, and they can have the voices, bring them in. I know that many of the coalitions have already representatives. For example, 13 coalitions have SMEs in their leadership. And 9 have youth represented. So, and 22 have CSOs in their leadership. So I think that's already good to bring in that voice. But we have 31 coalitions. Again, there's a challenge of how to, in this massive constellation, to connect all the dots within these coalitions. So that's what the hub is trying to do, is making sure that that we can connect, facilitate, like you are doing, the conversations, not just at the global level, but also at country level. And then secondly, what we're trying to do is that we will set up, and this was also asked by the Secretary General, a stakeholder engagement, networking, and advisory group. And the Secretary General was specifically referring to youth, indigenous peoples, producers, women, the private sector, and then also scientific and technological community. So we want to set up this group, but it is challenging because how do you get the voice of those that don't have a voice? How do you bring them in such a stakeholder group? And we want to work with kind of bodies that represent our representative. So, but they should self-organize, and some preliminary discussions have been going on. We want to set up that group so that we can listen to them and hear like what is going well, what is not going well, where is their voice not heard, and that we can possibly help and open doors and create trust. On the other hand, those members of that SENA group, which, how it is called, can also help us in doing our work better and letting us know if we're not doing the right thing. I mean, I just want to remind that the hub is looking at the now and looking forward. I mean, we have to learn the lessons of the Food System Summit, and a lot of things were great, but some things were not. But now it's about food systems transformation. The summit is done, and therefore we need to make sure that we listen to all these different groups that have so much to offer. I mean, you see it in the discussions that have been taking place already now, how much each of these groups have to offer. So I want to leave it at that. I hope that was helpful in the discussion. Oh, back to you, Steve.
That was definitely very helpful, Lena. Thank you so much. I love that in lifting up this narrative of governance, you're also speaking to us about how if we only listen to these voices from the ground, but we don't act, we really do erode trust. Right. And in that vein and in that line, I'd love to pass it over to Susan, who's been really showing us as a coalition of action, as we lay out these concrete actions, where the opportunities are for us as CSOs, local farmers and producers to really engage. And I'd love to hear your coalition of actions vision and how this can really unfold to ensure that we really do bring the trust back in this space.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And as one example of what a good discussion this has been, I've been adding some additional notes in response to the other speaker. And on this important point of trust and trust building, which you led into my comments with, I wanted to say that we've heard some very recent comments from governments on how they hear from their constituents that school meals programs, because of being a very tangible and visible way that the government helps serve people, can play that kind of trust building role, that when governments are able to effectively, not just provide school meals, but the broader package of intervention that they often represent, that people see that their government is there responding to their needs, and in a way that, can often represent up to 10% of a family's monthly income if the children are receiving a daily and nutritious meal in school. So that's one other point I did want to, I think I touched on it in my previous comments, but just wanted to note that the coalition does promote school meals as part of an integrated package of services. So it's not just about the meals themselves, but it's about other health services like immunizations, reproductive health and wash services. And these provide benefits and incorporate the whole community, including the providers of those services. But specific to this question of, how we're engaging across the food system and working with civil society and farmers and producers, I wanted to highlight the example of homegrown school feeding, which makes the linkages between school meals programs and smallholder farmers and the whole local production value chain. Because lower middle and low income countries are increasingly seeing homegrown school feeding programs as an opportunity to improve the livelihoods of local farmers and communities, and to strengthen the nexus between nutrition, healthier diets, agriculture, and social protection. The AU in particular, the African Union, has really taken up the mantle of leadership on this issue. It's been a big focus of their advocacy around school meals, and an annual day for the promotion of school meals programs that the AU hosts on March 1st of every year. And we've seen countries like Nigeria enacting homegrown school feeding at a large scale, where, and this was prior to COVID-19, but up to 6 million locally sourced eggs and 80 metric tons of fish were consumed by 9.2 million school children across the nation every week. We're also seeing impact in other parts of the world. For example, Brazil, up to 30% of all purchases for school feeding come from smallholder agriculture. So the school meals programs, the main message here is that they help create predictable demand. They represent, a structured and predictable markets for local food production and private sector enterprises. Local procurement can also be a strategy for diversifying diets, diversifying meals with fresh and nutritious food, locally fortified food, and to answer Jan's previous point, also for indigenous food commodities, and for promoting healthy diets and habits among school children that, again, kind of extend throughout their lifetimes, and I would imagine into their families' lifestyles as well. These programs also boost women's empowerment through targeting the critical role that women play in farming, food production, and preparation. And they help create new jobs in the food sector by engaging communities, particularly women, across the entire value chain from farm to school. And some of the recent evidence shows that up to 1,700 new jobs are created for every 100,000 children that are fed. There are a number of challenges for really scaling up homegrown school feeding in the way that it needs to be scaled up. It's very dependent on, strong coordination between the agriculture sector and the education sector in countries. But this really speaks to, I think, the kind of collaboration that we're all about promoting through our coalitions in this discussion. And it very much feels like the direction we need to be heading in, given the growing global food crisis, and also, of course, the tremendous impacts of climate change and the pressure that it is putting on food systems. More broadly, just opportunities for I'm feeling the pressure even more so coming out of this discussion on creating really solid opportunities for civil society collaboration in the School Meals Coalition. And I would just flag that the Communications and Partner Outreach Initiative more broadly is one of those opportunities. And any participant in this event who's interested in getting engaged should feel free to reach out to me, and I'll ensure that you get on all of the relevant lists for engaging in our activities going forward. So thanks again, looking forward to following up on all of this, and really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Susan. I think in lifting up everything in your remarks, you're really speaking to this interdependence and interconnectedness, right? That in this integrated package of school meals and the work that we're doing, we need CSOs, we need farmers and producers, and in empowering them, it also helps us advocate back to the governments about the effectiveness of these programs, right? And so we see that a healthy civil society engagement mechanism allows for the coalitions of actions to become even more robust in their convincingness, right, to member states of the need to join in on these initiatives. And so I'd love to now pass it over to Christina to speak from her coalition of action to really continue this conversation around the importance of integrating resilience into all of our developmental aspects, and how human rights lies at the heart of all of this work, and how can we have human rights without the deep engagement of these local actors. So I'd love to hear from your side in the work that your coalition of action is doing. How do we envision strengthening our engagement with civil society, farmers, and producers? Over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for what Susan, John, Lasse, all of you have been sharing, because it is. We work with schools, with climate resilient schools. We work with clean cook stoves. So there are so many things that we have not had the time to reach and to expand more, but we have many cross-cutting objectives in what we are doing. So thanks a lot for sharing that. So one thing that that our alliance have been trying to do offering this space to build resilient food systems, but also building synergies between what the UNFCCC policy frameworks are doing in relation to the Paris Climate Agreement and to the Sendai Framework Convention for DRR, for disaster risk reduction. So some of the solutions are related to climate adaptation, mitigation, the nexus, water, food and energy. And what I was mentioning, also the universal access to modern cooking, and very broadly, and in a huge agenda, the multi-risk reduction and management and the integration of resilience across all the policies and plannings. So the national adaptation plans, the national determined contributions, the disaster risk reduction plans, and the SDGs national planning. So as I mentioned, there is a special attention to engage the most vulnerable and risk. And we work with the small island states, with the arid and semi-arid lands, but we have a strong focus as well in the Sahel. So peace building, it is a priority. All the work, we have been engaging and inviting the other coalitions that are focusing on resilience. The Humanitarian Development and Peace Nexus group, we work very closely with them, and as well with the local food systems group. We have a lot of connections with the group, with the indigenous groups through John, and this is something that it is very important and very critical for, all the groups that we are working with, they're indigenous. So in the islands, in the Sahel, so we cannot even separate that, but it's very important to have the partnership from the Indigenous Food System Coalition, because they will bring a more specific discourse. So in the work on peace building and stability, we have been working with empowerment and with that has been led by youth. We have been looking into the stability pacts for social cohesion and looking into diets that are part of intangible cultural heritage, like the Mediterranean diet, as a bridge for peace. So that has been something that was done with Suu Foundation, and it was really excellent. That meeting with women from MENA region, and that are working with faith aspects, but also with cultural heritage. So the way of conserving and resilience also has these components of context specific and right-based. We have all the work done around not leaving no one behind, and focusing on participation, no discrimination, equality, legality, justiciability. And we have been looking into principles for transformation principles that are looking into ethical and equitable principles and reframing the narratives. The importance and the relevance of engaging youth or engaging faith groups. We have a very interesting comment during the meeting in Bonn, in Svesta, that these groups, they are not moved by economic interests. They are moved because they have these objectives, right? So this is very important. That makes that reframes narratives. It's focused on principles, values, and those are indicators of transformation. So another aspect that has been mentioned is that it has to be inclusive, and the work with social protection and gender responsive initiatives, and to make sure and give voice and agency to all the groups. Looking into the diets, the focus has been in nutrition sensitive and in traditional and resilient diets. The Mediterranean diet is one of the diets that brings more resilient mentally speaking. So this is some new work, and we are focusing on diets that are resilient also for mental health and for other aspects. So in the case of when we work with indigenous diets, their resilience that they bring is more is not only on the land that John shared, but is also spiritually, and it brings a different level of component. So this way of working with agroecology and with eco-agro food systems and knowledges, we are bringing diversification, but for nutrition sensitive diets. The groups that we are working with, they need that. And in relation to another principle of transformation is related to the tricentric governance that is enabling state, social, markets, and collective actions and social environmental contracts, but focusing also in risk and shocks sensitive. So the green, just, healthy, circular economy has been part of the low carbon and the local supply chains aspects, looking into agriculture waste and transforming into energy and regeneration. So I think that I will leave it here. Basically, we are inviting to all the groups that were before, that were from think tanks, research, farmers organizations, indigenous groups, civil society, women and girls initiatives with fisheries, youth, and faith. So the private sector is also joining, and we are looking very much into linking with intergovernmental organizations and large groups that bring several countries, vulnerable countries, like the Vulnerable Countries Forum that is being chaired by Bangladesh, or all the groups from the CARICOM, IOSIS. Those groups are right now one of the focuses, because it's quite helpful to have them in that way. So I leave it here. Thank you so much. And
thank you, Cristina. So we'll quickly just pass around everyone for 1 minute or less. Any closing thoughts? One last opportunity to speak before we close out the session. Thank you all so much for joining. Lena, Mai, maybe we'll go to you first.
Okay, I want to finish with a quote, if you don't mind, from a faith leader. And he said, "A healthy politics is sorely needed, capable of reforming and coordinating institutions, promoting best practices, and overcoming undue pressure and bureaucratic inertia. But even the best mechanisms can break down when there are no worthy goals and values, or a genuine and profound humanism to serve as the basis of a noble and generous society." I think I want to stop here. And I think it kind of reflects also a lot of the discussions we had. We need the politics and we need the policies, but we also need the humanity. Back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Francesco, Branca, do you have any closing thoughts for us? 1 minute or less?
Yeah, sure. I think I would like really to give the sense of urgency of this transformation. We're living in a terrible crisis, and we are not giving the healthy diet, let alone the sustainable diet, to half of the world population, and this is getting worse. So urgency for the change and urgency for a sustainable long-term solution.
Exactly. That makes perfect sense. Lasse, I'll pass it on to you for any closing thoughts. 1 minute or less.
Sure. I just want to say that I said this before, this is the decade of irreversible legacy. Like the decisions we make now are going to be sitting for a very long time into the future. So I will leave it at that and just say it's up to you, Lana, and other youth representatives to tell us what to do, because you're the ones who are going to be living with the consequences of what we do now.
Happy to tell you what needs to happen. Christina, any closing thoughts? You're muted.
Thank you, Lana. I am going to join what Francesco has said and building up from there. But one of the aspects that we are looking is into intergenerational justice. Working with the youth, what we are trying to achieve is we are bringing groups of students, and there is, and some of them, they are medical students, others are agriculture, but what is very important is that they don't have this eco-anxiety because they are so empowered, because they are so active, and this is making a large difference between groups of youth that are not engaged. So engagement, urgency, this is critical. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Susan, any closing thoughts?
Well, I was quickly looking through some of my notes, trying to find a quote that might be worthy of the one Lena shared. And the only thing I found is depressing, but I think speaks to the urgency point. It's something I read yesterday that said we have, quote, a real and present danger that hunger is going to derail the recovery that we're talking about, and that it's so necessary right now. This was specific to what's happening on education, but also, of course, very relevant to the food systems discussion as well. But I would just say, the urgency is there. We're facing a triple or quadruple crisis that drives that urgency. But I think, based on the representatives of this discussion, but probably even more so, I would imagine, by the audience you've convened, we have the ingredients that we need to get beyond this moment. We have demand from the next generation. We have new ideas and pressure on some different and new ways of working that are really necessary to get us there. So thank you again.
Perfect. And lastly, to Jan, before we pass to Steve for closing remarks.
Thank you, Lana and Steve. And first of all, congratulations for the discussion. I think we all learned so much, and this is important. I just have two separate messages. The first one is one of the biological functions that we perform the most during the day is eating. Those of us that we are lucky enough, we often have 3 meals a day. So that gives us 3 opportunities to do things differently and to reflect on what we are doing. It's ridiculous that we have unsustainable food systems that produce food that goes into the waste bin because we throw them away in our refrigerators. The second one is the UN Food System Summit left behind 31 coalitions. But perhaps what we need, and perhaps it could be one of the tasks for the coalitions, is an alternative narrative about food. And here I want to quote something that Christina said, and is the need for spirituality in relation to food. And here we think that the cosmogony of indigenous peoples and knowledge systems can really inform the way that we eat and the way that we relate to food. I think so long as we have children that don't know where the food comes from and they think it comes from the supermarkets, it is unlikely that we will have nutritious foods being eaten. So long as we keep eating in front of our TV, it's unlikely that we understand what we are really doing with our food systems in the planet. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jan, and thank you to all of the speakers for really bringing the wellspring of wisdom that you all have in your various bodies of work. I recognize that we got a lot of really interesting questions from our audience members that we'd love to share with our panelists afterwards. So as you've RSVP'd on our websites, we'll email out everyone's reflections thereafter. And so once again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience for bringing this space together with us as we really reflect on how we can ensure we transform our food systems in the right way towards a sustainable and equitable future for all. And with that, we'd like to close out the meeting, and thank you once again for participating. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you,